When it comes to adventure travel, or even just longer camping trips, unless you are that person who's happy living off of meat sticks, Oreos, chips, and warm beer, you are gonna want a way to keep your food and drinks cool. Although, now that I say that out loud, that actually doesn't sound too terrible. Huh. Anyway, since you're watching this video, I'm going to assume you're not a weirdo like me.
You're weird. You're a weird guy.
And you actually do want a way to keep your food and drinks cool. And so whether you are brand new to adventure travel and you're trying to figure out whether to invest in a cooler like this or go all in on a fridge, or perhaps you already have a high quality cooler and you're wondering if it's worth the upgrade to a fridge such as this. So in this video, I've got you covered. I'm gonna share all the pros and cons to each because there are, as with just about any piece of gear, good and bad with each of these setups. And then I'm also going to share my experience having extensively tested both this Yeti cooler and this Iceco fridge on multi-week trips in very hot climates. So let's dive right into it, and I want to start with the cooler. Now, a little bit on this particular cooler. This is obviously a Yeti. The model is a Tundra 45, but the important thing here is this is a roto-molded cooler, and while the Yetis tend to be about the most expensive, this one comes in at about $325. I think the important thing here is that it is a high-quality roto-molded cooler, and really what that means is that it has thick insulated walls, which means better ice retention, which is good for multi-day or longer term travel. Some other specs on this one: according to Yeti, this will hold 26 cans of your favorite beverage if you follow their instructions in terms of how much ice you should be adding to this in order to have decent ice retention. All right, and so with that out of the way, let's talk about some of the pros of using a cooler like this for your adventure travel. And despite what some people will tell you, there are some absolute pros to using a cooler instead of a refrigerator, and probably the most obvious one straight out of the gate is cost. And while this cooler is not cheap at $325, you can get a good high quality roto-molded cooler very similar to this for between about $150 and $200. And when you compare that to the cost of a decent fridge, which is gonna set you back between $500 and $1,000 plus, not including some of the other things that you'll need, which we'll talk about when we talk about the specifics of the pros and cons of the fridge, this makes a cooler a great budget option. And the second pro of using a cooler versus a fridge is really just the simplicity of it. There's nothing to break. There are no electronics. There's nothing that can really let you down when you're in the middle of a trip. And the third pro, in my view, kind of goes along with the last one, and that is because there is no need to plug this into power, you can position it anywhere you want in your vehicle. There's a little more flexibility. You can take it out of your vehicle, you can move it around camp, you can use it for day trips. So it's just a little bit more flexible than a fridge may be in that sense. Now, of course, using a cooler for long-term travel does have some cons as well. And in my opinion, the single biggest con and the biggest source of frustration that Christine and I had using a cooler for long-term adventure travel is simply the fact that in order to get any sort of decent ice retention, you have to put so much ice in these that it takes away a ton of space from storing food. Earlier on, when I mentioned the specs of this, I mentioned that Yeti says that you can hold 26 cans if you follow their guidelines for the amount of ice you need to use. If you compare that to the fridge, which is of very similar size, the fridge will hold 72 cans. That shows you how much space you're losing when you use a cooler versus a fridge. And we would oftentimes run into issues where we could only store 3 or 4 days worth of food and drink in the cooler, and we would have to re-provision because the ice just took up so much space. And speaking of ice, that leads me to the next con in terms of using a cooler, and that is what I call ice anxiety. Since you have to fill this with ice and make sure that there is ice in there, it leads to kind of constantly worrying about whether or not there is enough ice to keep your food, especially things like meats, cold enough. And you're always kind of thinking about where's that next place that you can go to get ice. I will say, if you are traveling and you are going to different spots each day, chances are you're going to be at a gas station every handful of days. And so you can typically re-provision with ice at a gas station, but it's just something you always have to be aware of. Another con is that you can't really keep a consistent temperature. And so again, when it comes to things like food storage, if you're worried about meats and things, perishable items in there.
Smell that.
shit. Smell that. Smell that.
Having ice and having to rely on that, it's just a little bit trickier to know if the food that you may have that's been in there for a few days, if it's still good or not. And then the last con, and this is something that just about anybody who's used a cooler can probably attest to, is at some point your ice will start to melt, and while it doesn't really matter for your drinks, for your food, it can lead to some situations where you have soggy food. It's just a reality of using a cooler. So those are, I think, the biggest pros and the biggest cons of using a cooler. So now let's talk about the fridge. This particular fridge is made by a company called Iceco. The model is a JP50, and the cost on this specific fridge is $559. So it is substantially more expensive than a cooler. But I should note, while you can get fridges that are cheaper than this, I would recommend against it. I did a lot of research before purchasing our fridge, and it seems that one of the most important factors when you buy a fridge is that you get one with a very efficient compressor. This one uses a Seekop compressor. It's a German brand. It's very similar to what the Dometics used to use. I believe now they're making their own compressors in-house. But the important thing is that having an efficient and high quality compressor means that your energy efficiency is much higher, which means that whatever your power management solution is, it's going to draw significantly less power, which means your fridge is going to be able to stay powered for a much longer time. And in my experience, that is absolutely critical. All right, so now let's talk about some of the pros of using a fridge over a cooler. And I think the first pro, and I've already kind of alluded to it, is it's just a much more efficient use of space. 72 cans in this versus 26 cans in an equivalent size cooler. So you can see right there that this will allow you to carry a ton more food and drink without having to re-provision as often. And if you are going to be out in the backcountry and exploring for multiple days or even a week on end, this is going to allow you to do that much easier than the cooler. Pro number two, obviously, no ice. You don't have to worry about ice, you don't have to worry about ice anxiety, and that also means you don't have to worry about soggy food. Pro number three is you can very precisely control the temperature. In fact, not only can you control the temperature, with a fridge like this, which is a single zone, but it can be either a freezer or a refrigerator. So you can set this to store ice cream or something like that if you really wanted to, or you can set the temperature. You have a wide range of options. We typically will set this to about 36 degrees and leave it there, and you can generally know that it's going to keep your perishables at whatever temperature you desire, which is another big benefit over a cooler. Of course, with all those pros do come a few cons, and con number one, again, is the price. This one I think is a tremendous value at $559, but some of the higher end brands or the dual zone fridges or the larger fridges can get well over $1,000, which is a lot more than a cooler. And that takes me to con number two, which is that in addition to the cost of the fridge itself, you also need to consider how you're going to power it. And typically there's an extra expense there. A lot of people will run a dual battery somewhere in their vehicle, which means you got to figure out where you're going to put that, install a dual battery, and get that whole thing set up. There's some complexity to that. Or you can do what we do, which is to use an external power source. In our case, we use a Jackery 500, which is plugged into the vehicle, and that is charging the Jackery while we're driving. And then when we stop driving, the Jackery is powering the fridge. Because with these 12-volt fridges, yeah, when you're driving, you can hook it straight up to your 12-volt adapter in your vehicle and it's gonna be charging, but you really don't wanna be running a fridge off of your primary battery, because that's just a great way to end up with a dead battery.
I mean, the battery's dead. The battery's dead.
What do you mean the battery's dead?
So in addition to the cost of the fridge, there's also the cost of a battery or a dual battery or whatever your setup is going to be, and that can add up pretty quick. You could pretty easily be looking at $2,000 all in to get the fridge and all the things you need to support it for your travel. So that is definitely something to consider as well. And that brings me to the last con that I have using a fridge. Whereas with the cooler, I talked about ice anxiety. With the fridge, it's power anxiety. And so we have found ourselves in situations where after being out in the backcountry for 4 or 5 days, even if we are driving, we're topping the battery up a little bit, but then we're discharging it. And eventually we get to a point where our battery power becomes very low. Now that can be remedied with a larger battery or possibly some solar panels, which we also have, but obviously that is only as good as the amount of sun that you have. So that's something to consider, is you're not totally off the hook, not having to worry about ice and reprovision. It's just a different sort of anxiety with this, making sure that you have enough power to keep your fridge going, because obviously as soon as you run out of power, your food is no longer cold. All right, so there's the pros and cons of using a cooler versus using a fridge. So which one is right for you? Well, my own personal take is this: a cooler will get you through just fine. In fact, Christine and I used this particular cooler for the first couple years that we were out overlanding and exploring, including a 2-week trip to Utah in August. And let me tell you something about Utah in August. It's hot. And this thing did just fine. Granted, we had to reprovision with ice every 2 to 3 days, and we had to go to the store a little more frequently, but we managed it just fine, and it was really a non-issue. With that being said, the fridge, as soon as we upgraded to the fridge, I don't think either of us will ever look back. While it's not necessary, it is one of the biggest convenience and luxury upgrades that you can make to an overland or adventure travel setup. It is just so nice to be able to store so much more food, so many more drinks, not have to worry about ice, and it really is a bit of a game changer for us. But with that said, if you're just going out on weekend trips or overnighters, I think a cooler is probably a pretty good solution. I don't think that a fridge is maybe necessary for that. If you are going to be traveling for longer periods of time or further out away from civilization, where maybe you can't get back into a store to get ice, then I think a fridge is nice. Or if you're just looking to make life on the road a little bit easier, I'd go with the fridge. So anyway, I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. It definitely helps us out. We appreciate it. We'll have more videos comparing overland equipment and gear like this one. And if you liked this video, then you might want to check out this one next.